This is Catherine Henning, and I did my individual field assessment on the city of Apalachicola and its oyster industry. So this is the city right here from an aerial shot. This is the Apalachicola River, and as it flows this way, it flows into the Apalachicola Bay. The city itself is located about an hour and a half southwest of Tallahassee, right about here. It has a bay of its own name right alongside of it, and St. George Island is its barrier island. This bay historically produced 90% of the state's oysters and 10% of the nation's oysters. And if you've ever been to St. George Island or been to Apalachicola, you know that this bay is very small, and that is a pretty big feat to produce 90% of a state's oysters in a bay that can be crossed by a boat in an hour and a half. So the city itself is historically a oyster harvesting, shrimp harvesting, and fishing community. They were put on the map by their oyster industry because the oysters are so good and they were so productive in this region, but recently they've begun to make a name for themselves as a cute, quaint, little historic river town. They are by no means a beach town, even though they are on the coast. As you can see here, this is their coast. It's the bay, it's brackish, it's not what most tourists want to swim in whenever they think of Florida and beaches. So the industry itself began in the late 1890s. It was wildly productive. Of course, there was a few hiccups in the middle there with different overharvesting and unsustainable practices, of course, but from the 1950s to the 1980s, they could produce or harvest over a million, if not over 2 million pounds of oysters a year. The industry itself employed at least 1,000 people, I would say. I didn't find an exact statistic for it, but there were many jobs, whether it be directly harvesting the oysters using these oyster tongs or cleaning and preparing the oysters for shipment around the nation. Apalachicola oysters are known as some of the best tasting oysters around the southeast, and I would arguably say around the world. So recently, the production of oysters in the bay has decreased significantly. This is partially due, in fact, to a couple of hurricanes and the BP oil spill, but I would argue that low production is primarily due to the fact that the city of Atlanta is consuming too much water than they historically should have. So the Apalachicola River right here is fed by the Chattahoochee and the Flint River. So in the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers made a lot of reservoirs by building dams along the Chattahoochee and the Flint River to supply the city of Atlanta with more water. They especially take a lot of water from Lake Lanier, which you can see in this picture here, to supply the city, but as they take more water from these reservoirs along the river, there is less water to flow down the Apalachicola River, and this has led to increased salinity in the Apalachicola Bay, which is spelling absolute disaster for the oyster industry. So Alabama and Florida have taken Georgia to court multiple times over unfair water usage, but they have not come to a conclusion yet or an agreement over fair usage. So higher salinity levels caused by low amounts of fresh water in the Apalachicola Bay has led to a complete collapse of the ecosystem, and the production in about 2012 or so was like the year they consider the collapse to have happened. So juvenile oysters are unable to latch onto reefs in these conditions, which is causing the low population of oysters, which is quite a unique thing because usually whenever a harvesting industry collapses, it's due to overharvesting. But in this case, there's just nothing to harvest because juvenile oysters aren't able to grow in the first place to become harvesting age. So this is spelling absolute disaster for the local economy. 65% of residents in Franklin County work in the seafood industry, and without oyster harvesting, the economy will definitely suffer because many of these people have been oyster harvesters for generations, and the public school system in this county is not the best. So they don't have any other job skills or the education that employers are often looking for whenever they're hiring. And if they were to try to get a job in a related field in the seafood industry, it is unlikely that all of them will be able to find a job because other species, such as shrimp and fish, are suffering as well due to increased pollutants and overharvesting in the bay. So I doubt that all of them will be able to find a job in the related field. So, in order to combat the collapse of the oyster industry, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission has placed a 5-year moratorium on the harvesting of wild oysters until 2025. They began in August 1st, 2020. So, a moratorium is effectively a complete halt of a practice. So, therefore, any oyster harvesters, unless they were to go work on farms in the area, will have no career to go back to. There's no way for them to make a living without branching out into other industries or going back to school or going to work somewhere else. It'll be very hard for them to make a living and survive with their livelihood being taken from them. I do believe the moratorium is drastic, but I believe it is necessary because if there's any chance of this industry recovering to its former glory, there needs to be no human interaction with the oysters for a few years. Um, and in order to truly fix this problem, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida have to come to an agreement over fair water usage because low salinity is what is causing this problem. So, in order for the population of oysters to recover, they must come to an agreement about freshwater usage to get the levels of the river a little bit higher than they are now, if not hopefully to the level where they used to be.